Hey Econ Kids, this is module 19, which is equilibrium, showing you this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model put together. So what is our ADAS model? It's taking our two short run aggregate supply curves and our aggregate demand curves, and we're putting them together to get an equilibrium price to show you the price level in the market. Now, your short run macroeconomic equilibrium is pretty similar to the micro equilibrium, right? Where the price level is above equilibrium, there's going to be a surplus and prices fall. And when the price level is below equilibrium, there's going to be a shortage and prices rise. So when you're looking at these particular things, we're going to have a couple of words here: demand shocks, supply shocks. All right. And what's going to happen in one of these is you're going to take your aggregate supply curve here, my aggregate demand curve here. Here's going to be my price level here, right? Price level. And then here's going to be my Y at, let's say, full employment there. And then here is my real GDP. Okay, so this is what's potential for output. Here's my price level right now. And then what you're going to show is, well, what happens when something like a negative demand shock happens? Well, if consumers and firms are more pessimistic, they don't really think the future is looking very good, you could see a negative demand shock, right? If that happens, you're going to see something like this occur, right? Aggregate demand is going to shift over here to AD2. And then the price level on everything is going to come down to like P2. Now that seems like it would be a good thing, because you're like, hey, look, price level came down. That's awesome. Things are cheaper. But down here, when we end up at Y1, this area that we're talking about from YF to Y1, this is not good news. That's going to represent unemployment, and it's going to be unemployment increasing. So here might be, let's say this is 5% unemployment there. This Y1 might be something like 8% unemployment. So yes, the prices are lower, but you don't have a job to pay for the prices anyway. So you're not going to be buying anything. And then you can get this slow spiral down of, well, you don't have any money, so you're not going to buy anything. And even if you have money, you're like, well, the prices might be cheaper tomorrow because look, they've been coming down. And pretty soon the vicious cycle of you not buying anything happens. And remember, this is GDP, right? And a big, huge portion of that is consumption. So if you don't consume, your economy is going to be tanking. And this could result in a recession. All right, so something like that might happen. When you look at a positive demand shock, you could see the opposite occur, right? Demand could shift out to the right. And something like maybe healthy stock market, or something about like maybe people are even more positive out there, they feel like they have more wealth, you might see demand shift out to the right. Okay, when that occurs, now all of a sudden price levels on things are going up, P3, and our employment down here, remember when we went to 8 to 5, this Y, 2 out this way, this might be 3% unemployment. So that's a good sign. Right now you're saying, hey, people are employed. You have to worry about inflation. You don't want that to get out of control where all of a sudden you have like hyperinflation or something like that happening. But as long as people are buying more, a little inflation is good. A supply shock, that can happen. So now if a supply shock happens, we're talking about something like a negative one. Maybe oil prices go up, which leads to like super high price in gas, right? So now here's my price level, and then here's my GDP, and this supply shock is the worst one. Because in this case, what we saw was here, supply shock happened, right? Higher price on oil, let's say, and my price went up from P1 to P2. So that's increasing, which means I have some inflation going on. And then I also went from YF down here to, let's say, Y1 there. So I went increasing inflation And at the exact same time, I had increasing unemployment. So I had two bad things happen. This is called stagflation. Your economy is stagnant and you have nobody working, higher prices, no jobs, not a good sign for your workforce or your economy overall. You can have positive supply shocks, labor productivity increases, something like that. You could shift to the right. That would be the best thing that could happen to your economy if you could see a positive supply shock, because then you'd be seeing lower prices and you'd see very little unemployment. So now here I have lower prices, right? So I'm not worried about inflation, and my employment here is like, let's say 3%. So my unemployment is at 3%. That's very, very good, right? So you have the negative one, which is probably the worst, but you also have the positive one, which might be the best. Hard to do this, right? Easier to mess with demand for sure, harder to deal with supply. Businesses, it's tough to make them do much of anything. So it becomes very difficult. Now, what happens when we add in our long run line, right? I can actually take both these graphs and put my long run line in there. And my long run line is going to be at YF. So it's going to come down right here. It's going to come down right here. And when I put my long run aggregate supply curve in here, you're going to be able to see what happens when you have a recessionary gap and an inflationary gap. So when you think about the first one here, when aggregate demand shifts to the left, okay, and I end up being back here, this is a problem, right? Because I'm worried about something like nobody having a job and the prices coming down. This is a recessionary gap, okay? This triangle basically right here, okay? I'm right here. This is the gap. Now, what might happen? This eventually could go down here, right? If people accept lower wages and then end up getting a job, doing something maybe for a little less pay. But that adjustment could happen, and it could take like a decade to occur, right? So that might be, man, oh man, we got to wait a while. But we're going to end up getting back to this long run aggregate supply curve. You could see an inflationary gap, okay? So my inflationary gap would be if aggregate demand shifted to the right, I'm paying more for all my goods and I'm up here, right? That inflationary gap up here means I have to worry a little bit about inflation for sure. And I could try to get back down here if I adjust demand, try to limit that a little bit, cool down my economy and get back to my long run equilibrium. If I let it self-correct, what's going to happen is eventually I'm going to end up here at this point with some more inflation going on, right? From where I was here. But it's going to go back, and the reason that happened is probably because people demanded a pay raise. So you're going to see, yes, you have less people employed, but those people are going to be making more money. So it's not as big a deal when you have the inflation happen. And again, it's going to take you a long time for that inflationary gap to come back to normal if you don't do anything or respond to it with any sort of policy. So this output gap is the difference between potential and actual output. We can calculate that out. And you can see here on the the business cycle, you can see a negative output gap and a positive output gap. We called that before like a recessionary gap and an inflationary gap, okay? So different words talking about the same thing. So if you're looking at that output gap, it's just the difference between what actual is doing and what potential is in our overall business cycle. So that first one there, that negative output gap, that would be our recessionary gap. Our positive output gap, that'd be our inflationary gap, and you're seeing it once here and once there. That would be the end of this section. Till next time.